Hey, welcome to the Happy Rant podcast. I am Ted Cluck, joined as always in studio by my good friends and partners in radio, Barnabas Piper and Ronald J. Martin. Boys, it is summer. We are three very in-demand men with our various travel schedules. But thanks for doing this morning. Is everybody back home at this point? Is everybody like in their home studio? Where are we?
Back home.
Back home, baby.
You're on your way out. I just got back. It's like ships passing in the night.
Oh, I know it, boys. It's crazy lives that we lead, but not quite as crazy as one Mark Driscoll. So it's been a long time on this program since we've done a little segment that I like to call DRISKY Business. DRISKY Business has been silent lately. We have not been paying attention to the exploits of one Mark Driscoll, but something fascinating drifted across my transom a few days ago via one Ronald J. Martin. And it's a tweet from Drisky. I'm just going to read this, okay? And then I'm going to describe the picture. And then I want you guys to kind of weigh in on what you think about it. So the tweet says, "Fired up to preach 9 and 11 a.m. tomorrow at the Trinity Church, exclamation. Want these signed sermon notes after I'm done, question mark. Get on the weekly list by sending your name and address to hello@markdriscoll.org," and then a fist emoji. And then below that is a photograph of Drisky's
question.
sermon notes.
Is it the punch fist or like the fist up in the air like the guys at the Olympics back in the day? Which fist is it?
It's the punch fist.
The punch
it's
fist.
The punch
okay.
fist.
Like the fist bump fist.
Yeah, connotations. Okay. We're doing a virtual fist bump. This is strong. So essentially, Drisky, apparently, and I'm going to parse this a little bit, and then I want you guys to do it as well. There's a weekly list that people can get on in order to get Drisky's autographed sermon notes. I think this is, I would say hilarious, but maybe sad is the better adjective. It's bizarre, man. It's bizarre that Drisky thinks there's sort of a market for his game-used sermon notes. I actually think it's insane. I think it's evidence of a ridiculous, gigantic, inflated ego. I don't know, boys. Talk me through this. Ronald, you're a man of the cloth. Actually, you're both men of the cloth now. I've got to get that right. But Ronald, let's have you go first.
Oh man, yeah. I think when I first saw somebody else tweet about this, it was one of those things where it's like, hold on, can this be real, right? So I went straight to Drisky's Twitter page, and indeed, he was the one that originally posted it. And so because one of those things is like, oh man, is this in context, out of context? I need to do some fact checking on this one, right? Yeah. But so I think like anybody else, you're shocked, but you're not shocked, but you're shocked, right? And you see it and you go man, a couple things come to mind, which is who doesn't exist in his life, who doesn't look over his shoulder and say, hey, Mark, probably not a great thing to tweet out.
Well, the answer to who doesn't exist in his life to do that is everyone. Everyone doesn't exist in his life to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a rhetorical question in some ways, but it's amazing because for a guy that's been through everything he's been through, and he's had the kind of, allegations just thrown
leveled
at him
against him.
Yeah. I mean, leveled against him. I mean, you just think man, throwing something like that out, you know what I mean? It just, how does it not just continue just to heighten everything, all of the bad feelings and the gossip and the rumors and the, what's going on with Mark? Has Mark changed? What's Mark's heart like these days? And something like that goes out, and it just, I think it just gives everybody a lot of fresh flame throwing, to engage in. So I don't know. It's hard to even know what to think about it because, again, on one hand, it's super harmless and irrelevant and pointless.
Yeah,
on the
totally.
other hand, you just go, well, Mark, why was it so important for you to tweet that out? And you have to.
Boys, what could we sign and offer to our audience? I mean, we have no show notes, so that's out.
Screenshots of text messages?
There you go.
Yes.
Get on the list if you want our signed
screenshots. Print them out and
screenshots.
sign them.
Yeah,
But
by the way, can you just sign for me?
That would require making a list of people that we're supposed to then send other things to. Like, the implication for him is that he has some sort of a weekly newsletter, prayer letter, braggadocio letter, marketing list. I'm sure he's marketing something. And so, you're signing up for a chance to win these just priceless artifacts of sermon notes that he has.
Boys, what would it take for us to get on that list? I think we should each throw our names in the ring. We should email to hello@markdriscoll.org. We should get on there and see if we can get any Drisky swag, because
There's no harm in that, Big T. There's
no harm in that, because that's just show prep in the sense that it would give us more stuff to talk about.
Well,
later
I
on.
nominate you to do this, Ted. I think you can take one for our team and sign up at Drisky's thing. I also have a little bit of nerves that if I signed up, he might recognize my name, because I used to work with him when he was before he went off the rails. Worked with him on some publishing stuff. So
interesting. I interviewed him for an article one time that I wrote for somebody, but it's been a long time, probably a decade. So I don't think he would remember my name. So I think we're safe there.
Should we offer to trade him something? Like, we'll send you a Happy Rant sticker in exchange for some signed notes or something?
Dude, I love it. A little barter economy stuff, man. That's good. That's hipster.
Let's go a little bit bigger than a sticker. Let's offer him some good swag.
But the good swag is worth money, and the sermon notes and the sticker are not. So,
but he thinks the sermon notes are worth a lot, so let's not insult him. Let's just get those sermon notes anyway.
I thought the point was to clarify the value of the sermon notes.
Dude, autographed sermon notes. I mean, really? Like, Piper, who does this guy think he is? Like, and we've talked about this ad nauseum. Like, we're not. I think the three of us, we're not, as a group, we're not autograph guys. But like to me, it's athletes, maybe like rock stars, and nobody else. Like, seriously, who does this guy think he is? It's ridiculous.
It's so striking, the difference too, because you remember there was maybe a year or two ago we talked about Tim Keller's sermon notes, because he posted a picture of his own sermon notes, and it looked like the scribblings of sort of a mad scientist. But he was sort of poking fun at himself. He's like, sort of, believe it or not, this is what I work off of. Yeah. And he wasn't offering it to anybody, and he didn't offer to sign it, and he probably crumpled it up and threw it in the garbage after posting the picture. So you've got that version, and then you've got this, which, it's like highlighted and whatever else. And and it's like, would you like this precious bronzed artifact of my preaching on? Did you what was the text or the topic? I didn't actually look super closely at that.
I didn't look either. Let me blow it up.
Here. This looks.
Well, and then look at his response to one of the comments below, which is like, basically, why are you doing this, Mark? And he says, it's just a gift.
Just a gift?
A gift.
Just being generous.
That's G-I-T, that's not G-I-S.
Religion and rebellion versus relationship in Galatians 5.
There we go.
So that's what we're working off of here.
Do you think we could get one of his signed, like, sermon-worn tap-out T-shirts from the early 2000s? And maybe that, like, I don't know, that bike chain necklace that a certain kind of guy was wearing in the early 2000s.
The 4-inch wide leather watch band.
Exactly. If we could get that would have some like kind of antique value at this point. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud, boys. But speaking of actual celebrities, and we need to keep this one on task this morning because we've got time pressures. Actual celebrities are on the show Stranger Things. So Netflix dropped its new season of Stranger Things. This has been, not surprisingly, a cultural phenomenon. Piper, you indicated in our pre-show meeting that you've watched 10 minutes of Stranger Things. I watched a season and a half before I got bored because it got a little too monstery for me. It just got boring. It became less about the characters and more about like special powers and all that, which is always a hard out for me. Ronald, you're still watching Stranger Things. And I think we should talk about it. I think we should talk about this cultural phenomenon. And I want to talk about it in light of the fact that by the time this program drops next week, Brett McCracken for sure will have written the TGC piece about it. So that's a thing that's going to have happened. And I want to talk about what McCracky's content is going to be.
I'm sure somebody at Desiring God will have found something wrong with the gender the gender issues in this show as well. I don't know if there are gender issues, but they will have found some gender issues, and that post will have gone up. It might be the week after because they tend to be a little behind the curve on what they're poking fun at.
So you don't even know if there's gender issues, but you know for sure that they'll find some.
Oh, absolutely. There's 100%. There's a 100% chance somebody there will take issue with like a strong female lead who does things. I know there's a strong female lead. Isn't she like named a number or something like that?
Dude, she's and there's Winona Ryder. Like all she does is shriek, but like her caterwauling is pretty strong.
That might suit the DG sensibilities a little bit better. But
that's true. That's true.
Well, there's a rumor now that one of the main characters, they're sort of positioning him to come out as gay.
Oh, of course, dude. I mean, it's a mainstream show.
Things burn in hell.
Dude, which one, Ron? Which character?
It's who's the main? I always blank out with names. It's one of the main kids.
Oh, Mike.
Well, it's the one that kind of went through all the stuff like with the monsters and all of that.
Oh, I see. Yeah. The one who's Winona Ryder's kid.
Correct. Yeah, the younger, like Winona's younger son.
Winona's younger son. Okay.
The guy who kind of went through it all. Yeah,
that makes sense.
His name. Yeah,
that makes sense.
I think his name is Will.
Yeah, Will, and they'll make him kind of heroic because of that. So, all right. I mean,
those are the rumors that I've been hearing.
So. That's a 2019 TV show then. I mean, it'll get preachy in all the common ways, but so yeah, that'll give TGC and Desiring God a lot to write about. But what do you think McCrackey's essay is gonna? What's the nature of it going to be? What are the high points?
I think he's going to go in on nostalgia.
Why it's bad?
No, because I think he would revel in nostalgia.
Okay.
In an artistic way, not like the warm hugs way, but
sure.
something about the artistry of nostalgia and the way it brings us back.
Yeah, the importance of remembering who we are.
Yeah, connects us to our youth.
Where we've been.
When back when things were, we had a simpler mindset and things were less cluttered and whatever. There's going to be I would bet on nostalgia as his entry point into the Stranger Things essay world.
There you go. Okay, Ron, you've spent a lot of years reading McCrackey. What do you think? Anything different than what Pipe has said?
I don't think I've ever read an article, but
quit lying. You're an avid reader.
Well, I think what's interesting is so I watched it. I watched about half the season, and one of the things that they've really, really done is they've hiked up the 80s-ness of it, like
in a
massive way. So they introduced a mall into the town called Star Court.
Baby, I love that.
So it's literally dripping with 1980s nostalgia. And of course, for us right now, for some reason, 80s nostalgia is to us what 50s nostalgia was in the 80s, which was somehow this kinder, gentler, more enjoyable, time, for our nation when things were just a little more, a little easier, a little more civilized, and they kind of present it in that sort of way. Things were a little more innocent. And so
it's interesting that we think of it that way, even though in the 80s nobody really felt that way. Yeah, like cocaine was washing up on the beach in Florida, like wherever you went, and like people were like literally gunning themselves down in the streets in DC. I mean, it wasn't like so amazing in the 80s, but
it was not a kinder time.
Nobody knew what to do with the AIDS epidemic. The Cold War was still going on. It was a mess. It was a major recession. It was wonderful.
It was
the
a
80s
neon
were great.
mess, is what it was.
Yeah,
it's a mess of neon and really shallow pop, music with great choruses. I have to add that last part.
Yeah, you got to be smug about that. But
I got to be a little smug about that because
80s music was a resounding relic of the 80s that carries on with us. The rest of it seems a little bit revisionist history to me.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, I don't know what that meant, but anyway, I think what's interesting is that what I would say is what McCrack is gonna hit on is I agree with Pipe, man. I think that there's going to be something to how we look back on history and make it to what we want it to be, and how somehow the gospel guards us against doing that. It shows us to look back into history the way it actually was.
There you go. Yeah, we can look at the painful elements of history, but know that in light of the gospel, we're okay.
But I think the more fascinating thing for us, and especially for you were sort of less in the 80s, Pipe. Ted and I would have been a little more of like 80s kids, but Nevertheless, I really find there has been an ongoing fascination with the 80s now for over a decade, and it is just, I mean, man, it's everywhere, right? I mean, music still is being like, all these production techniques from the 80s are still being used. They're showing no signs of slowing up. I mean, the 90s nostalgia has creeped in a little bit, but I would say like 80s nostalgia is still so high.
Do you think a lot of that is Do you think a lot of that is because the people who were kids in the 80s? So, I mean, I was 7 when the 80s ended, so I'm not really counting me. I mean, people who came of age in the 80s. So you guys, for example, are kind of at the place where you're at sort of peak cultural influence, peak power. You're the decision makers in what gets produced, what gets written, what gets released. You know, you now have kids who you can influence in terms of like they grew up listening to the music you loved, so it's sort of their nostalgia as well. You know, like that kind of thing. Because it's coming for the 90s. It's just, I agree. In the next 10 years, the 90s will, I don't know that it'll replace the 80s, it'll just join the 80s.
I totally agree. I think what's fascinating to me about it is how long it's stuck. Because I mean, like typically retro trending, it lasts a little while and then it kind of moves on. But like this 80s thing, I'm telling you, man, I've been kind of monitoring it, and it's well over a decade that everybody's just still geeking out for the 80s, you know? And
Ron, do you think it's because the 80s were really the last decade where people essentially all consumed the same stuff? You know what I mean? Like, there were just a handful of records in the 80s that everybody had. And I feel like the 90s introduced smugness as a way to be cool. And so the 90s, things started to get divisive in terms of, you know, you even had quote unquote the term alternative music in the 90s. Well,
it was cool to be cynical in the 90s.
And
it was cool to be cynical, and actually retro became like a thing to like identify with and be.
Whereas in the 80s, everybody was kind of like, we all love Duran Duran, you know, we all love I don't know, Michael Jackson or whatever. So yeah, I feel like the 80s was the last bastion of everybody consuming the same stuff in mass, you know.
Well, it was also like a future-oriented decade to where everybody was still like thinking of possibilities or what might be. But again, because we didn't have social media and we lacked a particular kind of 24-hour connectivity that we have now, there was still the ability to find things and explore things. So kind of talking about what you just talked about a minute ago, Big T, about like records. It's you still had to like kind of search things out, like to find certain kinds of bands and certain genres. They just weren't available. They just weren't all available at Sam Goody, right? Like you had to explore. There was like a sense of like artistry with like the things you had to go about in terms of discovering whether it was music or clothing or things of that nature. And then in the 90s, and then when the internet kind of blasted into being, it was like everything's accessible. We can all find anything we need. Everything that we want is available. And so I think there was a particular kind of there really was a particular kind of like innocence in regard to those types of things, where you had to be a little more in the know to get to certain places and to acquire certain things. And I mean, now you can Google everything.
Well, you had to either be in the know or you like lucked into things. Like listening to people who became writers, musicians, actors, whatever, coming out of the 80s. So like the Gen X crowd, they talk about sort of like having their mind blown when they discovered a whole different kind of music. Like all their friends listened to, you know, Michael Jackson or whatever, and they discovered this other thing, and it was just mind-blowing. There's no mind-blowing now. Everything is called mind-blowing, but everything is just sort of like here today, gone tomorrow.
Yep. Yeah.
It was. We have a much quicker turnaround now, right? Because things, right? So the 80s were probably the last decade where there was some like lastingness with like things, which is ironic since like the 80s are still lasting. So there's something so weird about that, because I mean, people look back on the 80s and they don't do it ironically anymore. It's like, no. I identify with that. I like that. It's nostalgic, but it's not merely nostalgic. It's like, it's actually what I like. It's actually what I'm drawn to. And again, that's me talking to dudes that, again, were more like you, Pipe. They were like, 10 years old when the decade ended. And so really growing up, it wasn't a big thing to them. They don't really have much of a memory of it. But later on, They were able to associate with it and identify with it. Why? Because it's so available. Like the 80s are just, they're so available. It's the weirdest thing.
It's really hard to do that with the 90s because the 90s is when things started being pitted against each other too. Like you had Seinfeld, Frasier, Friends, and these were shows that people picked. Usually it was like, that's my show. Like Seinfeld versus Friends is a debate that still goes on. I was having this argument yesterday with somebody. And I mean, it's not an argument because Friends sucks and Seinfeld is great. But in the 80s, again, there was like the 6 p.m. show, the 7 p.m. show, the whatever show, and you watched it or you went and like read a book or played outside or whatever. There wasn't options, and the whole like ethos of Seinfeld was essentially a cynical show about nothing. It was a show that just sort of, the whole thing was about sort of meaninglessness. And it was super entertaining, but just a whole different vibe than anything heartfelt, anything emotional. I mean, they had their rules on set were no hugging and no learning. You know, nice. So we feel nothing and we make no progress.
That was the ethos.
It's like college in 2019.
I mean, that was the ethos of the 90s, though. It made two things came out of the 90s, which was it's cool to be uncool. It was the beginning of nerd culture, right? Which is just reigns high. I mean, which is the reason why maybe the 80s still exists, is because it was the invention of nerd culture. And it's just cool. It's cool to not care. And before that, I mean, you could have said, well, the late 60s had a little bit of that. But by the time the 80s came, there was like a particular kind of optimism that the 80s, represented and generated. And then the 90s were a response to that, which was to say, no, actually, it all sucked. It was all fake. It was all plastic. There was no depth to it. So let's get back in touch with our feelings and let's become existential and like do all that stuff, right? And I think that still carries over. I think that like carried into the 2000s. But at some point, where do we find relief from that? Well, we become retro. We look to the past to find some relief from that. And the 80s, I think, was the easiest and closest thing to grab onto, where you could find some, you could find a return to some things that weren't so heavy. And,
Speaking of retro and speaking of the 80s was the decade of, quote, having a personal relationship with Christ, right? we remember this language, and we remember the 80s as the decade where you actually, like, got converted. So to speak, and now Reformdom has sort of thrown all of that into question, in that I feel like in Reformed culture, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, it's actually cool to not really know when you were converted, because the Holy Spirit pursues you, and we do believe this, but that whole language of like coming to know the Lord, coming to Christ, being converted, being born again. This is all stuff that kind of had its apex mountain in the 80s and has kind of become passé in Reformed culture. So my question to you guys, and maybe Pipe, I'll throw this one to you as this is your first official man of the cloth question.
Just remember, I'm a director, not a pastor. Just want to clarify that.
Yeah, exactly. We gotta make those distinctions for Ron. How do Reformed people come to Christ nowadays? This is kind of fascinating.
I mean, I think people come to Christ the way they have always done so. It's just we've moved from requiring people to timestamp their conversion, sort of the 80s, 90s, like what camp, what day, how old, to being skeptical of that. So now when somebody says, I gave my life to Christ at summer camp in 1997, we go, did you really? Like, was that real? How many times did you rededicate after that? Like, and I'm guilty of this. I'm skeptical of those things as well. But, and I think the language of journey, everything's a journey, a road, a process, a conversation. Mm-hmm. There's no beginning point or end point. I mean, maybe there's a beginning point. There's no definitive sort of like, I'm arriving anywhere. Yeah. And that has sort of taken over the language of Christianity, even if it hasn't changed the actual theology. So, yeah, I think most people are reluctant to be like, I gave my life to Jesus last week. Yeah, I got saved. There's that feels very sort of squeamishly uncomfortable.
Yeah, for sure. Ron, what about you, man? You're a church planner in this decade. How do you talk about this at Sub? What's the vernacular?
I mean, yeah, it's funny. We're so afraid of distorting grace, I think. We're so afraid of anybody thinking that, they have this ability to make a decision, for Jesus, that we've tried to just completely dismantle, all of that way of thinking, and that sort of those types of doctrinal points, and or lack of doctrinal points, or whatever you want to call them. I don't know. I mean, it's like I don't know if we've steered too far. I mean, I think we have to urge people to come to Christ. I mean, so we only know how to respond the way we respond, which is to make a decision, is to say, Jesus, forgive my sins. I embrace the cross. Cross is being sufficient for salvation. All those things, but like we have to urge people to do that. And so I think we've just been so careful with our language because we know that we came from all of those places where, it's the altar call. Everybody's walking up the aisle 15 times like that week, and hey, and if you've had a bad week, you can make up for it on Sunday. But
yeah, exactly.
Walk it back down, right?
Yeah.
And so like we've gone so far to like run the other way that I'm not sure. I think we try to avoid all of that language. And guess what? It's like easier because it makes us not have to like deal into the murkiness of that. And so I think, Reformed churches, their reputation for not being incredibly evangelical, evangelistic. Yeah. I mean, it's pretty well warranted, right? Because we're not really seeing like big movements of people coming to Jesus because we're really afraid of turning into this, this Charles Ryrie, kind of movement, or whatever.
Yeah, it's way easier to have spiritual conversations than it is to try to walk somebody from not believing in Jesus to saying, do you want to follow Christ? And if they say yes, then let's pray a prayer that indicates that you are bowing the knee to Jesus. That's not a thing we're comfortable with. Not even in church. Like if somebody came up after church to many people in our churches and said, I'm really intrigued by what I just heard in the sermon. Like, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? We would answer the question, what does it mean? But have a really hard time moving to like conversion. We've put it all on the Holy Spirit and failed to recognize that the Holy Spirit is like, well, maybe you should do something. Maybe you should say something. Maybe you should, you should walk that person into a place of salvation. And I think even the language of like leading somebody to Christ is something Reformed people are super uncomfortable with. Like we're so afraid of sounding Arminian, we forget to evangelize or something like that.
And then you go the other way too. So it's like, hey, we have to repent, we have to believe the gospel. And like that, I believe that's true and that's right, and that's what we have to urge people to do. But again, that's not incredibly inviting in the way that I think we can be we can be inviting in a way that like, honors the truth of the gospel and Christ's sacrifice without it being like so decisionistic, if that's even a word. I don't know if it is, and I made it up. But
dude, I dig that word.
Decisionistic?
That's strong. Yeah. If it's a made-up word, it should definitely be real.
You know what word I heard twice this weekend, and I'd literally never heard it before. But it was it was both in the context. Both times were in the context of like heavy, hardcore Reformed culture. The term is Sabbatarian. Have you ever heard that?
Oh yeah,
I have, but I have no idea what it means.
Well, it's somebody who's real hardcore about like not doing anything on the Sabbath. So having a conversation with this dude yesterday, and he's like, yeah, I grew up in this home. My parents were real hardcore Sabbatarians. Like they wouldn't let me toss a ball or cut the grass or do anything on Sunday. And I'm like,
it's like a breed of snake. Like a reptile.
You got vegetarians, you've got pescatarians, you've got Sabbatarians. It's defined by what you rule out. So vegetarians rule out meat, pescatarians rule out all meat except fish, Sabbatarians rule out all work or fun on Sundays.
Boys, I like to identify only with complementarian.
There you go. You're going to piss
Is that ruling out all women?
Easy.
No,
I feel like Pipe has become Mr.
I'm a narrow compliment. He's getting all man of the cloth on me right now. No, I'm a
dude.
narrow.
Yeah, man of the cloth versus man of the cloth.
He's man of the clothing me.
Yeah. Oh,
this is like head-to-head man of the clothing battle right now.
It's going to open up so many possibilities.
The cloth wars.
I love that you're both cloth guys now. This is so good, man.
Star Wars Episode 10.
That's right. Happy Rant, the Cloth Wars.
The Cloth Wars.
Oh, that's so bad. I really want to resign now. Oh my god.
Oh, that just makes it another episode.
Baby, you got that resignation letter. It's already written, man. It's in the desk drawer. It's already signed.
I love how you guys think I got to send you a resignation letter.
Dude, you do. That's the
listeners
protocol.
have to, so we expect you to do the same. And if it's less than 1,000 words, it doesn't even count.
Dude, did Trump send you a resignation letter? Did you get
anything less than 1,000 words and reform them doesn't count?
Yes, Trogs absolutely sent a resignation letter.
I'll have Joe Carter write my resignation letter. Is that cool?
Oh, dude, yeah. I mean, we'll have to...
Nine reasons I'm
Ronnie
resigning. Yeah.
Have to take a couple days off work to read that. I mean, it's a long one. Oh, baby. Speaking of, how's your time, man? Are we good, or we gotta close this thing?
I mean, I'm good with closing it. How do you feel, Pipe?
I will.
As a man of the cloth, how do you feel about closing it?
For the sake of not escalating this cloth battle, I'll defer to Ron.
This episode is shorter than any Reformed sermon that's happened in the last 15 years.
Isn't that great, though? Don't you feel like we're breaking new ground, baby?
It's concise.
It is.
Yeah, I'm still waiting. I'm still waiting for the Reformed sermon pendulum to swing back to like 30 minutes or less. I feel like it's gonna happen.
But even right now, like we don't know how to land this. Like we're still talking. We don't know how to shut it down. Like right now,
it's gonna take
stopped.
I know, baby. I know, but I can't. Because
one more point, baby.
Baby, here's my last point. It's gonna take the coolest pastor in Reformdom to start doing like 28-minute sermons again to get everybody to follow suit.
I think he's called Tim Keller, but he's resigned. He sent in his Joe Carter 9-point resignation letter, I think, last year.
Dude, he's had that in his desk drawer for a while. Like
absolutely.
Baby, here's me speaking for Pipe. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but we don't want you to resign, okay? Hang with us a little while longer until we get our leather goods, okay? Because we're looking at some leather.
Oh, absolutely.
I don't want to like.
I mean, I may be dumb, but I'm not stupid. I'm gonna wait.
I don't want to let the leather cat out of the leather bag in terms of our business dealings here.
Boys, I would never resign before the Christmas season.
Okay, so we've got you locked up through December. That's a 6-month contract. I like that.
Let's be honest.
Boys, we have done what we always do on this program, and that we've wandered to and fro throughout these many topics. And until next time.
The Happy Rant is brought to you by Resonate Recordings. If you go to resonaterecordings.com, you can see the full range of services they offer. So if you're considering starting a podcast, they are the ones we recommend going with. Again, go to resonaterecordings.com to see their prices, to connect with them and ask any questions, and to see what they can do to help you launch, edit, master, and improve your podcast. Again, go to resonaterecordings.com to see what they can do to help you launch and improve your podcast.